Welcome to Tech Tuesday number 58. And today we're going to talk about ripples caused by IP or taken advantage of by IP. Before we start, there's still 50 hostages that are not home yet, and we'll take a moment in the hopes that by tomorrow maybe it'll be over. So when somebody makes an invention or innovation in general, it's about change. Okay, it's not about staying the same. And IP, one way of looking at it, is about leveraging the change. And both of them are about the future. And now this is all a little bit of background. But we're not just talking about any future, we're talking about a future with agency. You know, the best way to predict the future is to create the future. So what I want to talk about today is not about trying to guess what the future is going to be like. I have a different presentation on that. But instead, how the fact that the future has agency, and in fact, we, the inventor, is part of creating that future, means something to IP protection. And, you know, a lot of exercises in future, they're kind of zero sum. Either one side wins or the other side wins. And you can't have both sides winning. But in innovation, often you can have both sides winning. And last but not least, I don't want to talk about, you know, chaos effects. You know, the butterfly flaps wing in Brazil and then it starts raining in Strasbourg. So that's not what I want to talk about. I want to talk about more logical, causative, predictable things. The question that is always behind it is, okay, we have a company, maybe we even have an IP budget, and the question is, what do we file IP on? What do we protect? So one way of doing it, which I recommend, but not on its own, is IP design. And IP design, really super simplified, you try to figure out what it is that the company needs from an IP perspective in order to, or from a product perspective, in order to succeed. You find choke points, meaning that everybody has to do something, and then you block them. But another way of looking at it is by looking at what can you cover. And really any place where an invention interacts with the world, whether it's directly or indirectly, is something which could be new and could be patentable. The important question is, how do you know what the world is going to look like? Is it going to look like the way it looks today? And I was once taught by Jakob Zilberger that it's not possible to computerize a system and the way of using it not changing. And ripple theory says exactly the same thing. It says the invention interacts with the world, so things change. The invention changes the world. The invention changes the actors in the world. And in fact, the invention not only creates ripples, but these ripples create their own little ripples. So really the question should be, how well do we understand the potential of a new invention? And that's all I'm going to talk today, mainly through lots of examples, is how to figure out where an invention might interact with the world, and especially where it might change the world. And then I leave it as an exercise to the people at home to figure out how to use IP in order to take advantage of all of these understandings and identifications. I don't know if you've heard about Jevons paradox, but Jevons paradox is that when something is cheaper, people want more of it. And he was talking about coal. He said if people make coal burning machines more efficient, people will not use less coal, they're going to use more coal. So how does that affect us? If you know what I'd call it a journey of the product is, how people use it and what they do with it, you can ask, how does an invention interact with, I don't know, customer journey at each step? And you can even ask, does an invention mean we don't need one of these steps? Give you an example in a second. And if we think about the Jevons paradox, AI is getting more efficient. That obviously means people are going to use more AI. We all use much more AI than we did 5 years ago. We still did then. But like I said before, we can't assume that the processes people use stays the same. And again, that's a whole point about ripples, is that you have to assume that the journey will not stay the same and it will not want to stay the same. And getting back to AI, people are now using AI more and more instead of keyword search. Okay, it's instead of. It used to be, I wanted to know what some word meant. I put it into Google. It would give me a dictionary. I'd click on it. If it were a anatomical word, I would click on a few pictures and read a few articles. But now it's different. Okay. I tell Google what is the hip bone, and it gives me an AI summary. And maybe, depends if you trust Google or not, I don't have to look anymore. So things change. And we call these changes ripples. And forgive me if the word ripple is a bit of a suitcase word in this presentation, but you'll understand why in a few slides. First, I'm giving you a definition from ChatGPT, which as usual is clear, simple, and kind of missing something. They say the ripple effect is it's the cascading impact that creation, enforcement, and violation of IP can have on lots of people. So there is that ripple effect, but we actually care about how ripples of innovation help us decide what to do with IP. Example, you have cars and they burn gasoline, at least, some of them do. They need gas stations. That's nothing to do with cars. It's a whole new business. They create CO2, where if you're scared of global climate change, you want to do something about it. And they cause traffic jams, which nobody likes. In any case, I call that leverage because gas stations, people used to buy gasoline or kerosene in the pharmacy. The whole idea of having a gas station is an entire new market. Now, you've heard people talk about traffic jams as a law of unintended consequences. We do something and something unexpected happened. Oh my, be careful. But with innovation, it's exactly the other way around. We want there to be consequences, and it's good to know which ones are going to happen. And as an IP practitioner, it doesn't matter if the consequence is good or bad. In both cases, there's valuable IP to be written. And another thing to note, usually it's not just that you throw one pedal into the pond and you get ripples. Usually it's more than just one. This connects to the general concept of compounding. So what happens when you make an invention or file some IP, which is more of a mental type of invention? I see it as unlocking possible pathways into the future. And if you identify these possible pathways, you can double down. imagine that we invent the phonograph. Phonograph gives us a new understanding. It tells us that listening to music and performing music are two completely, nearly unrelated activities. Okay? What a great idea. It means I can innovate in performances that have nothing to do with listening, like those studios. And it can also mean I can innovate in different ways of moving music from one place to another, which don't require moving an entire orchestra. However, in order to extract this new way of looking at the world, you have to want to do it. Now, I don't know if you want to do it, if you're going to try doing it, but one thing is for sure, people reading your patents and reading your marketing material and looking at what you've done will be generating this new way of looking at the world. And if you think of innovation or a mental tool, it doesn't matter if it's mental or actual, as a way of looking at the world, it's much easier to go along what is known than what is not known. Okay, so that's why I call it pathways into the future. Now, the idea of compounding is that what we do tomorrow will be based on what we do today. And that means that on the one hand, you might be committing to a certain direction, but on the other hand, you can go much faster. And if you're familiar with the concept of a flywheel, that's exactly what's happening. Now, IP, yes, we're about IP. IP can take advantage of the commitment and can take advantage of the fact that traveling on this road, which is set up, is faster. That's not the only thing that can be compounded. When we make an invention, we generate insights. And insights also compound. And the way they compound is you use your insight for a new situation and you generate new insights. Now, insights are like bright lights, and here's an example, Uber, okay? There was a period when whenever you asked a VC for money, you said, oh, I'm like Uber for toothbrushes. I'm like Uber for social media. Okay, so generate a lot of focus. It helps you see things that you didn't have before. The very process of inventing and generating these insights is, I look at it like education. When you invent something, you gain new skills, more data, more insights. You gain a way of looking. That's exactly what we're supposed to do in school. And that's why, getting back to the question from last slide, how do you extract it? A preliminary question is, do you want to learn? Do you want to learn about the ripple? And last but not least, and super important definitely today in the AI days, data itself is also a ripple effect because it's generated by having the new machine, and it can support compounding because if you have data, you can generate new data. Ripple, 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 ripple. Does it have to ripple a new invention? The answer is no. If I invent a new cloth for cleaning CRT screens, which have static, so dust, gets attracted. How should I say it? There do exist CRT screens. People will buy the product, but nobody cares about it. Another example is a standard ripple that you're familiar with. I have a pond. I drop a pebble in the pond, and you get ripples. As you get further away from the pebble, they get smaller. So imagine I have a way of making iron from iron ore. And I have a 3% increase, a method of increasing efficiency by 3%. Okay, that is super valuable to anybody making iron. But if I build iron bridges or building a house with iron or eat using a steel fork, it really doesn't affect my life at all. Sometimes it's the opposite. You drop one pebble and the world changes. Example, the airplane. The automobile as well, of course. The internet. Okay, so some inventions make huge changes. The typical interesting type of ripple is what a duck does. Okay, the duck doesn't just get into the water, it continues swimming and it generates a wake, which is really a continuous generation of ripples. And why does that happen? If a company, I don't know, like Apple used to be maybe, continues innovating in a certain direction, okay? They started with a smartphone, made it even smarter, made it even more, made it even less, more. They continued generating new ripples. Sometimes the ripple is completely hidden, and I just read an article about how flamingos create underwater vortexes in order to attract the bugs, or whatever you call them, plankton, into their mouth. So if you have a trade secret which makes a method of manufacturing cheaper and nobody knows what it is, you won't have any ripples, but it's very, very significant. And another kind of hidden ripple generation is tsunamis. So here's an example of a ripple that hasn't happened yet. Shor's algorithm is an algorithm for quantum computers for factoring large integers. And as you may know, a lot of digital signatures and cryptography today are based on the fact that it's difficult to do this. Now, Shor's algorithm doesn't yet have a computer to run on. So it's like when you have a tsunami on one side of the ocean, and when you look at the ocean, I mean, a big landslide on one side, you look at the ocean, you don't see anything, but when you get closer to shore, suddenly it all happens. So ripples might be invisible until they suddenly hit. Now, why? We already said that we're going to decide if we want it to ripple or not. And therefore, the question to the practitioners is, can you figure out which one will create more ripples? So here's a partial list of factors which might help you decide on ripples. The context. You look in the market and in the technology. Do you have feedback loops, feed-forward loops, other amplification loops? Do you have mechanisms that block? Okay, for example, fax machines. They were blocked in the US by AT&T. So it didn't matter what a great invention it was. AT&T blocked it because they didn't want people sending words instead of talking. There might be interests that push back against the change. There might be interests that simply value stability. There might be a very big need, a lot of sick people with a disease. If you make a small improvement, everybody wants it. What problems are being faced? Some ripples are their own worst enemy. They create a resistance to change. And some ripples simply require too much attention for them to succeed. Okay, if you're in a company and then now it's a product market fit stage and they just did it and now they want to scale, nobody's going to listen to any innovation you have because there's no resources and no attention. And depending on the situation, the IP that you need and the analysis you're going to do are going to be different. Let me give you an example. You might think that the right thing to do is if you have an invention to patent it. But if you're going to have a lot of ripples, maybe you want to keep the invention a trade secret and file your patents on the ripples themselves, which may be more valuable. So even a simple decision like that, do you keep something secret or not? Do you protect the invention of the ripples? Depends on your belief on how much ripple you're going to have. I mentioned flywheels and virtuous cycles before. It's really simple. You have something that works. You understand more. And once you understand more, you can have something better that works. or you have an idea, you get data, and the data shows a new way of doing it, or new consequences, or a bigger market. And here's an example, okay, which is kind of real. Let's call it like that. You invent some sort of concoction with 4 different compounds. You inject it into a nerve and everything's wonderful. And then you improve it and you do it with 2 compounds. And then it turns out that just injecting salt water is good enough. So besides the fact that you have a completely different innovation, you also need other IP, because any IP that you had about injecting compounds is valueless. If you manage to build such a flywheel, the flywheel generates incomes. What are you going to do with that income? The company. Is it going to expand sideways? That's ripples inside the company. Is it going to generate new customers? Are you going to take advantage of these customers? It's going to generate new pain points. You know, if you have cars, you're worried about flat tires. And all of these different types of things are targets for IP, and IP and creating a virtuous cycle of flywheel and managing it or maintaining it is in part an IP function. Because, you know, when you have something moving, it's very easy to uh, put a, what is it called, a stick between the spokes and you get stopped. I mentioned before about ripples inside the company and outside the company. So an improvement in manufacturing will often have big ripples in the company, but maybe invisible outside. On the other hand, if I make a better mousetrap, that could cause big ripples outside. There are a lot of businesses that survive because we don't have good mousetraps. And why does this happen? Because when you have an invention, it shows what is possible and it creates a vision. It makes copying or avoiding what you're doing, but not ignoring, okay, more likely. So that helps define the pathway. It also creates confidence in a certain direction. And it also creates a spotlight effect because everybody is looking at it. And I mentioned outside the company. So in particular, you have to think about your competitors. They see what you're doing, they get new ideas. But it's not only them. Suppliers, distributors, customers, regulators, all of them are going to get new ideas when they see what you're doing. And sometimes it's even not somebody connected to you. So think about all of the technology developed for airplanes, like composite materials, aerodynamics, and so on, which is today used in cars. Boeing, how should I say, they don't make cars. But if they develop something, car companies get great ideas out of it. And ripples can also affect your customer's customer or your supplier. And here's an example, you know, close to my heart, sealed bearings. Okay, so some parts of the bicycle have bearings so that it'll spin. Gunk can get into the bearing, so you have to open it and clean it out and put new pieces in, and it's a big headache. But if you use sealed bearings, okay, the bicycle manufacturer or the wheel manufacturer generates sealed bearings, sells it to the bicycle company, which sells it to me, and it affects me, and it also affects the maintenance person because now he works differently. So I've been talking about all of these ripples, and what does it matter? I call it a functional aspect. Sometimes a ripple creates risk. Now, difference between risk and uncertainty is risk, you just don't know what's going to happen, but you know everything around it. So solid state drives, okay, flash memory, replacing hard disk drives, we know, okay, for many years, since the 1990s, that it was going in that direction. The only question is when will it happen, what is the price point going to look like, and so on. So there's risk if you go into one of the fields, as opposed to the other one. Sometimes we get uncertainty. Okay, if you look on LinkedIn, the big question is, how soon will AI replace pan attorneys? Tomorrow? 5 years? Never. Okay, we just don't know. But it's definitely a ripple effect from creation of AI. People who created these generative AI systems, they were not thinking about pan attorneys. Sometimes ripples create opportunity. Windmills allow you to dry land and make the Netherlands larger. Sometimes ripples mean that you're going to have to change. The government decided to use unleaded gasoline instead of leaded gasoline. At the very least, the gas stations need to change. Some components in the car need to change. It's not a choice. It's not about innovation. It's about here's change and you got to do it. Sometimes ripples mean something comes to an end. Okay, the one horse shay, gone. Why? Automobiles killed it completely, except for around Central Park. And sometimes it's a new beginning where we don't know where it's going. So blockchain, we don't know where it's going. What are people going to do with it? But we can see the ripples. I found an interesting um, metaphor, or I don't know, example for ripples, and that's a ladder. And their goal was looking at something else, but imagine a barista making coffee, and she does it better. I mean, she does it faster. Instead of 60 seconds, it takes her 55 seconds. Well, her direct manager is happy. It's faster. People that go to the coffee shop and write reviews on Yelp, they care about it being better or worse. The customers, what they're looking at is customer satisfaction. Ongoing improvement is when that barista teaches other baristas to do it in 55 seconds instead of in 60 seconds. And that is what high levels look like. FZs, you know, um, 8%, 10%, means that you can go from profit to loss. That's what the CFO is looking for. If it prevents repetitive stress injury by the barista doing the same movements all the time, and we're preventing that, it could be that nobody cares about it except for the barista, okay? Because she might be a low-paid worker and the company doesn't really care what she does to her wrists. So what we see here is that we have some sort of value chain, and the value that is created ripples up. And as it ripples up the value chain, the value might go up or might go down. If you remember, I said some ripples, like in a pond, get smaller as you go away, and some of them get bigger. For example, if you think of an avalanche. The important thing to realize is that when a ripple goes up the value chain, it perhaps creates more value, perhaps makes it easier to extract the value, and it usually encourages other people to find alternative ways of creating that ripple. And that means that if other people are clever enough, your original way of creating that ripple is less interesting. And therefore, protection on that original way is less important, which means, like I said before, maybe a trade secret. You might remember about 25 minutes ago, I said that the word ripple is a kind of suitcase word. And one of the reasons is because we have to agree what exactly is rippling. Okay? And let me give you a few possibilities. One is technology. Okay, so Moore's law tells us that new cell phones are going to be more powerful and more energy efficient than previous cell phones. If there wasn't Moore's law, it probably wouldn't happen. It can be IP. As you understand your invention better, you file a new patent application. Often, in the priority year, where you talk about better consequences and more important things. Sometimes your company is rippling. I said before, when you do more efficient manufacturing, so there's rippling inside. But think about self-cannibalization. If the company has a better way of doing something, what happens to all the people doing the less better way of doing it? Sometimes what's rippling is a business world. Okay, there was a business of building web pages, but it only came into being because there was the internet. And at some point, the internet became commercial and people realized that they need to be there. In some cases, it's an ecosystem. There's an ecosystem supporting us poor people trying to use AI. And as AI becomes more sophisticated, that ecosystem is rippling and changing and growing and deforming. I said before, one of the important things about rippling is our insight, our understanding. And as patent attorneys, we just have to look at the power of hindsight. We know how hard an inventor worked on making an invention and figuring it out. And then the examiner says, oh, it would have been obvious to do that. And what do we say? No, that's using hindsight. Nobody thought of it. Nobody understood it. Nobody thought you could do it. Roberto Verganti says that innovation is not about ideas, but about meaning. Okay, it's not that you have a new idea, is that things get new meanings. And when things get new meanings, it automatically creates ripples. How fast does a ripple move? It's a great question, and there are all sorts of theories on futurism. And like I said, I have a presentation that I've given in the past. But more important, which one of all of these things that ripple is moving faster? Now, usually IP can be the fastest. Why? Because we don't actually have to solve anything. We only need to put words to paper. We do need to understand. And let's give it the opposite. Infrastructure. Infrastructure changes very slowly. So which IP is more valuable or more likely to be valuable? A better way of sending more data on existing fibers, or a new fiber which can handle more data? Okay, since infrastructure changes slowly, it's often the new way of sending data on existing fibers. We talk about the mind being the thing that's rippling and understanding being important. And I think what's important to remember about mind is that speed is one thing, but jumping is probably more important. There's a guy called it paradigm shifts, not paradigm evolution. Now, more interesting perhaps as an IP person is that different types of things that can ripple, business, technology, ecosystem, and so on, is that we can use IP to slow things down or speed them up. Speeding them up is easier and maybe more painful by giving out your secrets and telling people what to do and so on. But we're licensing out patents. But if you file a patent ticket or a minefield, which are different things, but not now, they slow down the rate at which people want to change because IP is interfering. If you have an insight and you hide that insight and you pretend it doesn't exist, your competitors don't have it, and therefore the ripple moves not only your competitors, your suppliers, your customers, and so on. It slows down the advance of ripples. Talking about ripples as if they happen instantaneously, but obviously they don't. And not only that, if you have one ripple, it's going to be followed by another ripple, which might undo the first ripple. And we can see it in microchip. It's a very common way of looking at things. You have new technologies, and a few years later, you have another new technology. And the old technology and the entire ecosystem built around it disappears. We want to make sure that if we have IP, not only do we use it to delay effects or ripples or the next ripple, but we also want to make sure that the IP we fire will be effective when the ripple reaches the target area. And think about battery technologies. Keep on being new battery technologies, better, faster, more efficient, and so on. If you invent a new battery technology, when are people going to start deploying it massively in, I don't know, electric cars? That's when your IP has to be effective. And since we generate the ripples, we can decide, for example, when is a new product going to be released. Moore's law is an external definition. Every 18 months, we expect a cycle. But some companies like Apple have a yearly presentation of new technologies. That is setting a tempo of innovation. Now, I'm talking about ripples moving and so on. If you remember how long it took to get from fourth generation cell phones to fifth generation cell phones, and now to sixth generation cell phones, you understand that reality is interfering. Okay, if there's a sudden recession, people don't invest. If there's no investment, the ripple can't move, and everything freezes. And we see it time and time again. When you have a ripple, is it like a gentle wave or not? So if you have gentle waves, it slowly pushes your boat to shore. But sometimes you get to a tipping point, and ChatGPT is an example of one of these ripples. So they developed a large language model. Great. And then a better one. And it allowed to make all sorts of applications. But then one of the applications was, let's have the language module use language in order to communicate. Oops. The world's a different place. Or think about the iPod or Napster or MP3. What did it do to music labels? Decimated them. And now streaming is having this ripple effect on bringing them back, because it has to do with finding a way of concentrating revenue streams. So you can't always know when you're going to get to one of these tipping points using ripples, but you can perhaps know where it's going to happen, not when. In other words, I'm an AI company. I'm building AI. I don't have to be a genius to know that an interface for AI to work with people is going to be a tipping point. I don't know what the interface is, but I know it's going to be a tipping point, because people will not directly use AI unless they have an interface. And there's a lot more people than applications. Of course, if I focus on high value applications like traffic design, it's not going to be important. And the fact that we have agency means that we can help the tipping happen. You notice in the ripples, you see a reflection of the sky, but you also see dark areas, shadow. So the ripples lead the way, but they also distract your attention from other ways of doing things. So 120 years ago, people made electric cars. They do again now. What happened for 100 years? Well, the gasoline engine led the way. Or think about hidden inventions. Okay, neural networks was a big thing, and it was in competition with what we might call good old-fashioned AI. And for a while, AI was winning. But then computing systems got strong enough that you could actually do neural networks. Not just talk about it, but actually use it. And suddenly everybody's using neural networks and not good old-fashioned AI, symbolic AI. Sometimes the ripples hide inventions that your competitor can use to bypass you. And an example is silicon versus germanium semiconductors. It used to be believed that silicon was a junky material, it's out of control, and you can't use it. Use germanium. But then they managed to use it. Wham! Silicon is the way to go until it won't be. One of the things we can do as patent attorneys is we can identify that our client is following an insight or is on a path. And we can ask, okay, what is being bypassed? What is being ignored? And sometimes it's right in front of you. You do DNA sequencing and you discover that you have genes, but most of the DNA is junk. You can either call it junk and ignore it, or you can say, might be something really valuable hidden there. And the same thing with epigenetics. You can either say, wow, I have genes, let's get more genes, or you can ask yourself, how does the body decide which genes, do what and when are they activated? This leads us, of course, to the question that I asked at the beginning, what do we cover? So sometimes covering the source of the ripple is good. Unfortunately, doing that usually does not cover the consequences, and often it quickly becomes obsolete. We have the opposite question. Well, there's many different consequences. So should I cover all of them? Just the ones that are exciting now? The ones that we need or our competition needs? Where there's money? Where there's potential? The one that fit with my timeline? Where we're creating the greatest value? And the answer is, I have no idea. And I'm just asking these questions so you will ask them. When you ask, what should I cover? You can ask these more detailed questions about what can we possibly cover. Ripples are about things that change. Now, luckily for you, the slide ended because I had another 10 to write down. But here's just a few things that can change due to ripples that affect the AI. What the clients want, what the customers, who they are, new problems, new needs, processes of making, processes of selling, how value is extracted, leverage opportunities, time to market, relationships, dependencies on suppliers and others, whether the market is centralized or not and how big it is, radical changes in scale. What's the regulatory authority think about you? Okay, there was no talk about AI regulation until a few years ago, and people were doing AI. Last but not least, if you're moving, you have a ripple ahead and to the sides. If you're not moving, you have ripples in all directions. And Kellogg's cornflakes is an example. Kellogg's invented cornflakes, and then Post, who went to one of his sanitariums, said, oh, it's a great idea, I'll invent my own breakfast cereal. Okay, and Kellogg's 20 years later invented Rice Krispies. That's 20 years. So in general, we like aiming the IP for where the ripple will get to. And an example of looking to the future is Levi's jeans. Okay, forget about the true story of what happens there. Okay, if you see people digging for gold and they need tents and they need clothes, they're going to need clothes that they can wear for 3 months straight before they come back to get new ones. Okay, who's going to do it? I'm going to do it. I'm going to take tent fabric and make jeans. Or here's an example of a lateral ripple. Okay, people might have not imagined it, but it's still a lateral ripple. You make eyeglasses, you do the optics well enough for people to be able to see, suddenly microscopes become a practical field. Now, why is this interesting? Because I was talking about static ripples, but when you move, you also create a wake, like the duck in the previous slide. What does it mean, a wake? First of all, you can ride in somebody else's wake, and there have been studies showing that ducklings going behind the mother duck can save a lot of energy in swimming, and in fact, even be pulled along by the mother duck. And that's what you think about as Me Too innovations, okay? Somebody has a product, you're doing it too. Or maybe you're the duck in front, and people are going to follow in your wake, and what you want to do is use IP to block them. Maybe trade secrets, maybe patents. Or others can block you. And here I'm using the famous example of the toilet seat and the hole in the toilet seat. So somebody invented a toilet seat, and once you have a toilet seat, you might use it for all sorts of things. And you have to think, what is the next innovation going to be? And then somebody invents a hole in the toilet seat, because that's one of the things you might want to do with the toilet seat. If people know where the ripple is going to be, can block you. To summarize, inventions create ripples. The ones in the mind are important, but also the physical world sets constraints and opportunities. We generally file IP based on the size and location of the ripples and whether or not IP can do what we want it to do, when we want it to do, and so on, prior art, panability, and so on. But this presentation is not about that. It's about figuring out where the ripples might be, and that's why I gave you all sorts of examples and taxonomies. And if you don't have any ripples, client says, no, there's no consequences. There's kind of two possibilities. One, maybe the innovation is not so great. And two, maybe you don't really understand what the real potential is of the innovation. So just to give you an example of what you do when you do this ripple analysis, let's say you invent a way to send high-speed internet through existing concrete and asphalt, highways. You can have all sorts of ripples coming out. Let's say cars picking up music, from the highway. Which one of them should you protect using IP? Which one of them give you unusual leverage? And last but not least, the company Wavy, what are they going to do tomorrow now that they invented it? With that, I stop the recording.